It started as just another ordinary morning, the kind that felt so comfortable, so familiar, that you'd never expect anything to go wrong. I was folding my daughter's tiny, colorful clothes, preparing for the day ahead. The faint hum of the washing machine in the background mixed with the early morning light streaming through the windows, and for a moment, everything felt peaceful. But peace can be deceptive, a fragile thing that shatters in an instant. Then my phone rang. An unfamiliar number lit up the screen, and my heart lurched for reasons I couldn't quite place. Something about that call felt different. My hand shook slightly as I reached for it, my mind instinctively bracing itself for whatever was coming. The voice on the other end was frantic, almost frantic. "Ma'am, there's a fire at the kindergarten. We're evacuating as fast as we can, but it's spreading quickly." Her words seemed to tumble through the line, scattering across my thoughts like shards of glass. A fire? At my daughter's kindergarten? I couldn't wrap my mind around it, couldn't understand how something so terrifying could be real. My body felt cold, paralyzed, and yet I was flooded with the urge to act, to move, to get to her as quickly as I could. Dropping the clothes from my hands, I grabbed my keys. My only thought, get to her, just get to her. But as I hurried out the door, a surge of panic jolted through me. Ethan. Where was Ethan? Was he already there? I fumbled with my phone, calling him over and over, each ring feeling like a lifetime, echoing back to me with no answer. I tried to stay calm, tried to focus on the road, but each unanswered call sank into my chest, twisting the panic tighter until it felt like I could barely breathe. The drive felt endless, the streets blurring together as I raced towards the kindergarten. All I could think about was her little face, her bright smile, her laughter echoing in my memory. I had to get to her. I had to know she was safe. But deep down, a quiet, terrible thought began to take root. Something I tried to push away, but couldn't fully ignore. What if I'm too late? When I finally reached the school, the scene was a nightmare come to life. Flames tore through the building, licking up the walls like hungry hands reaching for the sky. Dark, thick smoke billowed out, filling the air with a smell that made my stomach turn. A sickening mix of burning wood, plastic, and something else I couldn't place. The sound of sirens blared around me, firefighters rushing back and forth, shouts filling the air. And then I saw him. Ethan was standing by an ambulance, holding a child in his arms, gently lowering her onto a stretcher. Relief flickered through me for a brief, hopeful moment. He had her. He had saved our daughter. Everything was going to be okay. But then I saw her face. The little girl in his arms wasn't ours. It was Lily, his first love's daughter, the child of the woman he had once planned a life with long before we had ever met. And he was holding her, protecting her with a look of relief and tenderness I hadn't seen in so long. Not my daughter, not our daughter. A cold realization settled over me, sharp and unforgiving. He had saved her. And my heart twisted in a way that felt impossible to bear, as if it was breaking into pieces that I could never put back together. My eyes scanned the chaos, desperate, searching for any sign of her, any glimpse of my little girl's small, familiar frame. But she wasn't there. My throat tightened. The scream caught in my chest as I tried to force out her name, tried to call out to her, but the words wouldn't come. I was frozen, watching as the last spark of hope flickered out, leaving me hollow, numb, as the awful truth settled over me. The fire had already taken her. As the minutes passed, each second felt like an eternity. I felt myself fading, breaking apart, lost in the noise and the smoke and the unimaginable emptiness of a world without her. And through it all, Ethan held on to Lily, his eyes never leaving her, his arms wrapped around her as if she was the most precious thing in the world. The flames roared on, devouring everything in their path. But inside me, there was only silence. A silence so profound, so all-consuming, that it drowned out everything else. I didn't know it then, but that silence would stay with me. It would follow me home, haunt me in the quiet hours, fill every corner of our house. And in that moment, as I stood there, watching him cradle another woman's child, I realized that nothing in our lives would ever be the same again. The fire had died down by the time we were told to leave. The charred remains of the kindergarten still smoldered, smoke rising in thin, pale wisps, remnants of the blaze that had taken everything. I remember the way the crowd moved, people drifting away, murmuring softly as if afraid to shatter the awful quiet that hung over the place. But I couldn't bring myself to move. It felt wrong to leave, as if by walking away, I was accepting that she was gone, that our daughter was really lost. Ethan stood a few steps away, holding Lily's hand tightly as her mother, Allison, finally arrived, rushing to her daughter with a relief that was as sharp as my grief. She pulled Lily into her arms, her face a mixture of tears and disbelief. And Ethan watched them, his eyes hollow, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like a shroud. I wanted to scream, to demand why he had chosen her, to make him understand the devastation he had left in me. But the words caught in my throat, tangled with the ache that spread through my chest, and all I could do was stare at him, numb and empty, as he released Lily into her mother's arms. Someone touched my shoulder, a police officer, gently guiding me to the side. She spoke softly, explaining that they needed to take our statements, that we had to answer questions, fill out forms. Her voice was distant, words barely reaching me through the haze that clouded my mind. Everything around me felt surreal, like a terrible dream I was desperate to wake up from. "Ma'am, do you have any belongings of hers you could describe?" the officer asked, her gaze sympathetic. "Anything that might help us identify." Her voice trailed off, but I knew what she meant. She wanted details, anything that might help them find what was left of my daughter. The words tore through me, ripping open a wound that I didn't know could hurt more than it already did. I tried to answer, but my voice cracked, my mind unable to conjure the words. How do you describe a child in fragments, in pieces of memory that you realize will never feel whole again? My hands shook as I stammered out details. Her favorite dress, the way she loved to wear mismatched socks, the little hair clip she insisted on wearing every morning. The officer nodded, her face softening as she wrote down each word, as if she could feel the weight of every detail. When we were finally allowed to leave, Ethan walked beside me. But I couldn't look at him. Each step felt heavy, each breath a struggle as we headed toward the car, the quiet between us more deafening than the flames had been. I slid into the passenger seat, turning my face to the window, watching the scorched remains of the kindergarten fade from view as we drove away. I couldn't bring myself to speak, to acknowledge the man sitting next to me, the man who had made a choice I couldn't understand, a choice that left our family shattered. The car ride home stretched in silence, his hands gripping the wheel, his knuckles white as he stared straight ahead, lost in his own guilt. But I couldn't bring myself to feel any sympathy. My grief was too deep, too raw, and every time I looked at him, I felt it twist into something darker, something I didn't recognize. When we finally pulled into the driveway, he stopped the car, but neither of us moved. For a long moment, we just sat there, the engine ticking softly as it cooled, the only sound in the thick, suffocating quiet. I didn't mean for this to happen," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I could feel him searching for the right words, some way to make this right, to reach me through the wall that had built itself around my heart. But I couldn't look at him, couldn't speak. All I could see was the image of him standing there, holding Lily, his relief painted on his face, while I had been left with nothing. "You didn't mean for this to happen." My voice came out in a harsh whisper, each word laced with a pain I couldn't contain. "Then why? Why wasn't it her? Why wasn't it our daughter?" He flinched, my words hitting him like blows, but I didn't care. I wanted him to feel it, to understand the depth of what he'd done, the choice he had made without even thinking. But his face, his expression, it was like a mask, grief and guilt fighting for control as he tried to find words that would never be enough. I thought she was closer," he said finally, his voice breaking. I thought I'd be able to save them both." His words hung in the air, thin and fragile, as if they might shatter with the weight of my silence. But nothing he could say would bring her back. Nothing could erase the image burned into my mind of him holding another child, another woman's daughter, while mine was left behind. I opened the car door, stepping out without another word, leaving him alone in the silence he had created. I didn't look back. I couldn't bear to see his face, to see the man I had once trusted, now a stranger, whose actions had forever changed our lives. As I walked into the house, I felt the emptiness settle around me, filling every room, every corner, until it was all I could feel. And in that emptiness, I realized that whatever we had before, whatever love, whatever trust, it was gone, consumed by the flames that had taken our daughter. The house was unbearably quiet, the kind of quiet that presses down on you, heavy and suffocating, making each room feel like a void. The laughter, the little footsteps that used to fill this space, the bedtime whispers, and the songs we'd sing on lazy Sunday mornings, they were all gone, leaving behind only silence. It was a silence so thick it felt almost alive, a presence that settled into every corner, every piece of furniture, reminding me of all I had lost. For the first few days, I drifted through our home like a ghost, not touching anything, not changing a thing. Her toys lay scattered in the living room, her shoes still by the door, her favorite pink backpack hung on the coat rack. I couldn't bear to move them, as if doing so would erase the last traces of her presence. The world outside moved on, but inside these walls time seemed frozen, suspended in a moment I could neither escape nor accept. Ethan and I barely spoke. He moved around the house quietly, like he was afraid of disturbing the delicate balance of grief that had settled over us. I'd catch glimpses of him sometimes, standing in the hallway, looking at our daughter's bedroom door, his face drawn, haunted. But he never went inside. He kept his distance, avoiding the places that still held her memory, as if he couldn't bear the weight of it. I watched him from a distance, feeling a strange detachment, a numbness that dulled the sharp edges of my anger, but did nothing to lessen the ache in my chest. In those moments he looked almost like a stranger, a man I used to know but couldn't recognize anymore. And I wondered, bitterly, if he felt the same. One evening, after days of silence and solitude, I found myself standing in her room. The air was thick with the faint scent of her, something sweet and familiar that brought tears to my eyes the moment I breathed it in. Her bed was still unmade from the morning of the fire, her favorite stuffed bear lying across her pillow, the soft fabric worn from countless hugs. I walked over to the bed, sitting down slowly, as if afraid the weight of my sorrow might break it. The room was filled with echoes of her laughter, her endless questions, the way she would curl up next to me at night, her small hand tucked into mine as she drifted off to sleep. I closed my eyes, letting the memories wash over me, each one a bittersweet reminder of the life we had lost, the future that would never come to be. I heard Ethan's footsteps outside the door, pausing as he reached her room. He lingered there, silent, as if he didn't dare cross the threshold. Part of me wanted him to come in, to share this space with me, to show me that he was hurting too. But another part of me, the part still raw and aching, couldn't bear the thought of him intruding on this sacred space. After a moment, he turned and walked away, his footsteps fading down the hall. I listened until the silence returned, settling over me like a shroud, binding me to this room, to this memory, to the life I could never have back. Night after night, I would return to her room, sitting in the darkness, whispering to her as if she could still hear me. I'd tell her how much I missed her, how sorry I was that I couldn't be there for her when she needed me most. Sometimes I'd talk about Ethan, about the choice he made, the choice that had torn our family apart, and in the stillness I'd wait, hoping for some kind of answer, some sign that she was still with me, that she understood. But the silence was my only response, a constant reminder that she was gone, that all I had left were the memories and the ache that filled every corner of my heart. As the days turned into weeks, the weight of our grief settled into a rhythm. Ethan and I lived side by side, but we were miles apart, bound only by the fragile thread of our shared loss. We moved around each other like strangers, each of us locked in our own world of sorrow and regret. Sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of him watching me, his expression unreadable, as if he wanted to reach out but didn't know how. But I couldn't bring myself to meet his gaze. I couldn't bring myself to forgive him, to let him into the space that was filled with her memory. Because every time I looked at him, all I could see was the choice he made, the life he had saved while ours was left to burn. The isolation became my refuge. I clung to the silence, the numbness, the void that kept me from feeling the full weight of my anger and pain. And each night, as I sat in her room, whispering into the darkness, I realized that this was my life now, a life defined by what I had lost, by the daughter I would never hold again. And somewhere in that emptiness, in the hollow ache that had become my constant companion, I knew that the love I had once felt for Ethan was slipping away, fading like the memory of a distant dream. The days dragged on, each one stretching endlessly into the next, and yet I felt trapped, as if time itself had ceased to move forward. Our house, once filled with laughter and the warmth of a family, now felt like a tomb, each room echoing with memories that hurt too much to revisit, yet were impossible to avoid. I found myself walking from room to room, as if searching for something, yet knowing there was nothing here that could ever bring her back. Our daughter's bedroom remained untouched, her belongings exactly as she'd left them. I could still see her little drawings on the walls, stick figure families, lopsided suns, and animals that only she could recognize. Her bed was unmade, her pillow still holding the faintest trace of her scent, that soft, sweet smell that was uniquely hers. I spent hours in that room, sitting quietly, letting the memories wash over me, each one a reminder of the life we'd lost. Ethan avoided her room altogether. He passed by it with his head down, his eyes averted, never daring to step inside. Part of me wanted him to come in, to sit with me in this space filled with her memory, to share in the pain that weighed down my heart. But another part, a darker, angrier part, couldn't bear the thought of him here, intruding on the only place where she still felt real to me. One night, as I sat on her bed, lost in the memory of her laughter, I heard his footsteps outside the door. He paused, his shadow stretching into the room, and for a moment I thought he might come in. My breath caught, a mix of hope and resentment swirling inside me, warring for control. But he hesitated, standing there like a stranger in his own home, and then he turned, his footsteps fading down the hall, leaving me alone in the silence once again. I couldn't understand him. I couldn't fathom how he could just walk away, how he could ignore the memories that surrounded us, as if by avoiding them, he could somehow erase the pain. But maybe that was what he wanted. Maybe he needed to forget, to bury the past so deeply that it would never haunt him again. But for me, there was no escape. The memories clung to me, followed me from room to room, filling every corner of our home, every space in my heart. I whispered to her sometimes in the quiet of the night, as if she could still hear me, as if my words could somehow reach across the divide that separated us. "I miss you," I'd say, my voice barely a whisper. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I'm so sorry." Sometimes I talked about Ethan, about the choice he'd made, the choice that had ripped our family apart. I asked her if she understood, if she could forgive him in a way that I couldn't. But the silence was my only answer. A heavy, suffocating stillness that reminded me that she was gone, that all I had left were these memories, and the ache that seemed to fill every corner of my soul. As the days turned into weeks, Ethan and I fell into a rhythm, a pattern of avoidance and unspoken words. We moved around each other like strangers, bound only by the fragile thread of our shared loss, each of us locked in our own world of sorrow and regret. Sometimes I'd catch him looking at me, his expression unreadable, his eyes filled with something I couldn't name. But I never met his gaze, never acknowledged the pain I saw on his face. Because every time I looked at him, all I could see was the choice he'd made, the life he'd saved while ours had been left to burn. One evening, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table, a mug of tea growing cold in my hands. The house was quiet, the silence wrapping around me like a shroud, heavy and suffocating. Ethan came in, hesitating in the doorway, his eyes flickering between me and the empty chair across from me. He sat down slowly, his hands folded in front of him, his gaze fixed on the table. For a long moment, neither of us spoke, the silence stretching between us like a canyon, wide and impassable. I could feel his presence, the weight of his guilt pressing down on me, filling the room with an unspoken tension that neither of us knew how to break. I miss her too," he said finally, his voice barely a whisper. There was a rawness to his words, a vulnerability I hadn't seen before. But I couldn't bring myself to feel any sympathy. My grief was too deep, too all-consuming, leaving no room for anything else. "Do you?" I replied, my voice cold, sharper than I intended. "Because all I see is the choice you made." He flinched, my words hitting him like a blow, but I didn't care. I wanted him to feel it, to understand the depth of my pain, the bitterness that had settled into my heart, poisoning everything we once had. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came, his gaze dropping to the table, his hands clenching into fists. I watched him, feeling a strange satisfaction in his silence, a dark sense of justice in the way he struggled to find the right words. But there were no words that could fix this, nothing he could say that would make up for the loss that had torn our family apart. I stood up, leaving my untouched tea on the table, and walked out of the room, the weight of his gaze following me. I didn't look back. I couldn't bear to see his face, to see the man who had once been my husband, now a stranger burdened by a choice he could never undo. As I climbed the stairs, I felt the emptiness settle around me, filling every space, every corner, until it was all I could feel. And in that emptiness I realized that whatever we had before, whatever love, whatever trust, it was gone, consumed by the flames that had taken our daughter. And so I returned to her room, my only refuge, the only place where she still felt real to me. I sat on her bed, whispering into the darkness, holding on to the memories that were all I had left. And in that silence, I found a strange kind of comfort, a painful solace in the knowledge that while she was gone, her memory would always remain, untouched by the choices that had shattered our lives. The emptiness had a way of seeping into everything, filling even the smallest, most insignificant moments of my day. Every corner of the house seemed to hold a reminder of what we had lost, fragments of a life that now felt distant, like a dream slipping away the moment you open your eyes. I found myself avoiding the things that used to bring me joy, the books on my nightstand, the garden I used to tend to, the photographs lining the walls. Each one felt like a betrayal somehow, as if allowing myself a moment of distraction, a flicker of happiness, would mean I was letting go of her memory. And so, I clung to the grief, wrapped it around me like a shield, a way to keep her close, even as the world around me urged me to move on. Ethan and I drifted further apart with each passing day. We barely spoke, each word a struggle, each glance filled with unspoken questions that neither of us dared to voice. The man I had once known, the man who had been my partner, my confidant, my friend, had become a stranger, a shadow passing through our home without leaving a trace. One night, after hours of lying awake, staring at the ceiling, I got out of bed and wandered through the quiet house. The floors creaked under my steps, the silence pressing down on me, thick and unyielding. I found myself drawn to her room, the only place where I felt any semblance of comfort, of connection. Her bed was as I had left it, untouched, a shrine to a life that had ended too soon. I sat down, letting the memories wash over me, each one a painful reminder of what I could never have again. I closed my eyes, picturing her face, the way she'd look up at me with those big, curious eyes, always asking questions, always wanting to know more about the world. She had been so full of life, so eager to learn, to explore, to experience everything, and now she was gone. I whispered to her in the darkness, the words spilling out in a soft, broken murmur. "I miss you so much," I said, my voice catching on the words. "I don't know how to do this without you. I don't know how to go on." The silence answered me, as it always did, a reminder of the void that had taken her place. I felt the weight of it pressing down on me, filling every inch of my soul, until it was all I could feel, all I could see. It was as if the world had faded to gray, every color, every sound dulled by the ache that had become my constant companion. After a while, I felt Ethan's presence in the doorway, his shadow stretching across the room. He didn't speak, didn't try to come closer. He just stood there, watching me, his face hidden in the shadows, his expression unreadable. Part of me wanted him to say something, to bridge the distance that had grown between us, to tell me he felt the same loss, the same emptiness. But another part of me, a part I barely recognized, wanted him to stay silent, to leave me alone in this grief that was mine and mine alone. I didn't want his guilt, his regret, his need for forgiveness. I wanted my daughter back, the life we had lost, the family that had been torn apart by his choice. "Why are you here?" I asked finally, my voice cold, distant. "Why do you keep coming here?" He didn't answer right away. I could feel his hesitation, his struggle to find the right words, and when he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. Because I miss her too." The words hung in the air, fragile, almost desperate, but I couldn't find it in myself to feel any sympathy. My anger had turned to something colder, harder, a barrier that kept him out, kept him from touching the grief that had become my refuge. "Do you?" I asked, my tone sharp, bitter. "Because it doesn't feel like it. It feels like you're more interested in avoiding the pain, in pretending this never happened." He flinched, my words hitting him like a blow, but he didn't argue, didn't try to defend himself. He just stood there, silent, his hands clenched at his sides, his gaze fixed on the floor. I looked away, unable to bear the sight of him, the weight of his presence in the room where she should have been. Every time I saw him, every time he tried to reach out, it felt like a betrayal, a reminder of the choice he'd made, the life he had saved while ours had been left to burn. After a moment, he turned and walked away, his footsteps fading into the silence. And once again I was alone, the darkness closing in around me, the memories filling the emptiness he had left behind. Life without her had become a series of routines, a rhythm that carried me from one day to the next without truly living. Mornings blurred into nights, meals left untouched, conversations that never began. The world outside moved on, its noise and chaos so distant that it felt like I was watching it from behind a glass wall, unable to reach it, unable to feel anything beyond the hollow ache that had settled in my chest. Ethan was still there, moving through the same rooms, walking the same hallways, yet it was as if we were strangers living in the same space, each locked in our own silent prison. The home we had built together, once filled with laughter and warmth, had become a place of shadows and echoes, memories lingering in the corners like ghosts that refused to leave. I avoided him, avoided any room he occupied, avoided his presence like he was the very embodiment of my pain. But sometimes I'd catch glimpses of him, sitting in the living room, staring at his hands, his face drawn, his eyes distant. He looked older somehow, as if the weight of his guilt had aged him overnight, hollowing him out from the inside. But even then, I couldn't find it in myself to reach out. The anger, the resentment, had wrapped around my heart like iron, hard and unyielding, a reminder of the choice he had made, the choice that had cost us everything. One night, after another sleepless stretch spent staring at the ceiling, I found myself wandering through the house, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The air felt heavy, thick with the weight of everything unspoken, everything unresolved. I stopped by her room, hesitating at the door, feeling the familiar pull of her memory, the bittersweet ache that filled me every time I stepped inside. But tonight, I didn't go in. I couldn't. Instead, I stood there, my hand on the doorframe, my mind drifting to the life I had lost, the family that had been torn apart by a single irrevocable choice. A choice that had left me alone, isolated in my grief, unable to move forward, unable to let go. And in that moment, a thought crossed my mind, a thought that had been creeping into the edges of my consciousness for days, maybe weeks, a thought I had tried to push away, but could no longer ignore. What if this was it? What if this was how my life would be from now on? Trapped in a home filled with memories that brought only pain, bound to a man I could no longer love, a man who had become a stranger, a reminder of everything I had lost. I leaned against the wall, feeling the cold seep into my skin, grounding me in the reality I had been avoiding. I couldn't keep living like this, caught between the past and the present, haunted by the life we once had, the life that had been taken from us. And yet, the idea of leaving, of walking away from everything we had built, from the man I had once loved, filled me with a dread so profound it felt like a weight pressing down on my chest. Could I really let go? Could I really walk away from the only life I had ever known? Leave behind the memories, the home, the marriage that had once meant everything to me? But as I stood there, the silence pressing in, the emptiness stretching out before me like a void, I realized that I was already halfway gone. The love I had felt for Ethan had faded, replaced by something cold, something unrecognizable, a numbness that filled the space where my heart used to be. I had already begun to let go, to pull away, to retreat into a place where he could no longer reach me. It was a quiet kind of grief, this realization. A mourning not just for my daughter, but for the life I had lost, the marriage that had been shattered, the future that would never come to be. I felt as though I was standing on the edge of something vast and unknown, a place where the past no longer had any power, where I could finally lay down the weight of my anger, my resentment, my sorrow. But it was a terrifying thought. The idea of stepping into that unknown, of leaving behind the familiar pain, the familiar memories, the familiar silence that had become my only comfort. I closed my eyes, letting the silence wash over me, feeling the cold seep into my bones, grounding me, steadying me. And in that silence I found a strange kind of clarity, a quiet acceptance of the choice I would have to make, the path I would have to walk alone. Because I knew deep down that this silence, this numbness, would only grow, would only consume me if I stayed. And I couldn't bear the thought of losing myself to the same emptiness that had already claimed so much. As I stood there, feeling the weight of that decision settle over me, I realized that maybe, just maybe, it was time to let go. To step out of the shadows of the past, to leave behind the life that had become a prison, to find a way to live again, even if it meant walking alone. I didn't know what that life would look like. Didn't know if I had the strength to make that choice, to take that step. But as I turned away from her room, as I walked down the hallway and back into the darkness, I felt a glimmer of something I hadn't felt in a long time. A faint, fragile hope, a spark of possibility, a glimpse of a future that was mine to shape. And for the first time since the fire, I felt a sense of peace, a quiet resolve that settled over me, steadying me, guiding me forward, because I knew, deep down, that the only way to honor her memory was to live. To find a way out of the silence, out of the shadows, and into a life that was mine to create. The days that followed felt different, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why. The grief was still there, heavy as ever, pressing down on me like a weight that I'd carry forever. But alongside it, a faint sense of purpose had begun to grow, a quiet, steady resolve that whispered to me in the stillness of each morning, urging me forward, reminding me that there was life beyond this house, beyond the walls that had become both my sanctuary and my prison. I started small. Little things, like opening the windows to let in the sunlight, even though it felt almost sacrilegious to bring light into a place filled with so much darkness. I found myself lingering in the garden, watching the flowers bloom, feeling the warmth of the earth beneath my fingers as I pulled weeds, trimmed branches, cared for something outside myself. It was strange, this act of tending to life, of nurturing growth, even as my heart ached with the knowledge of what I had lost. Ethan noticed, though he said nothing. He watched me from a distance, his gaze heavy with questions he never dared to ask. I could feel his presence, his silent yearning to bridge the gap between us, to find some way back to the life we once had. But every time I met his gaze, could see was the choice he had made. The choice that had forever altered the course of our lives, that had left our family fractured and broken. One afternoon, as I was cleaning out the cabinets, I came across an old photograph of the three of us. Me, Ethan, and our daughter, her smile bright, her eyes full of wonder. We were at the beach, her small hand clasped in mine, her hair wild and windswept, her laughter echoing in my memory. I sat down on the kitchen floor, clutching the photograph, my heart aching with a mixture of love and loss, of gratitude and regret. For a long time, I just sat there, lost in the memory, feeling the warmth of that moment, the joy that had once filled our lives. But as I looked at the photograph, I realized that the life in that image, the love, the laughter, the togetherness, was gone. It had vanished in the flames, lost to the same fire that had taken her, leaving only ashes and echoes. Memories that would never be more than a faint whisper of what had been. And in that moment, I understood that I couldn't keep living in those memories. I couldn't keep holding on to a past that no longer existed, clinging to a love that had been broken beyond repair. If I was going to survive, if I was going to find a way forward, I had to let go. Not just of her, but of him. Of the life we had shared. Of the dreams that would never come true. That evening, I sat down with Ethan for the first time in what felt like months. My hands folded in front of me, my gaze steady, my heart calm in a way that surprised even me. He looked at me, his face lined with worry, with guilt, with a sorrow that mirrored my own. "We can't keep doing this," I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. "We can't keep pretending that things can go back to the way they were. She's gone, Ethan, and so is everything else." He looked away, his hands tightening into fists, his jaw clenched as he struggled to hold back whatever emotions were churning inside him. I could see the pain in his eyes, the grief that he had tried so hard to bury, the guilt that had eaten away at him, leaving him hollow, a shell of the man he once was. "I know," he said finally, his voice breaking. "I know she's gone, and I know it's my fault. But I thought that maybe we could find a way." I shook my head, the sadness in his words only deepening the ache in my chest. "It's too late, Ethan. Whatever we had, it died with her. We can't keep holding on to the past, can't keep trying to salvage something that no longer exists. It's not fair, to her memory or to us." For a moment, we just sat there, the silence stretching between us, filled with all the words we had never said, the regrets that we would carry for the rest of our lives. I could feel his sorrow, his desperation, his need to find some way to make things right. But I knew, deep down, that there was nothing he could do, nothing either of us could do, to change the truth that had torn us apart. I hesitated, the words catching in my throat, but I knew they had to be said. "I think I need some time. Away from here. Away from everything." He looked at me, his expression a mixture of confusion and hurt, as if he couldn't quite understand what I was saying. You're leaving?" I nodded, feeling a strange sense of calm settle over me, a quiet certainty that I hadn't felt in a long time. "I need to find a way to live again, Ethan. I need to find myself, to figure out who I am without her, without us. I can't do that here, surrounded by memories that only bring me pain." He didn't respond, his gaze dropping to his hands, his silence a reflection of the truth we both understood but had never spoken aloud. Whatever life we had shared, whatever love had bound us together, it was gone, lost to the flames that had taken everything. As I packed my things that night, the emptiness of the house seemed to press down on me, the silence filling every corner, every shadow, reminding me of all that I was leaving behind. I looked around, taking in the familiar rooms, the photographs on the walls, the remnants of a life that had once been filled with so much hope, so much love. And as I closed the door behind me, as I stepped out into the cool night air, I felt a sense of freedom, a lightness that I hadn't felt in months. I didn't know where I was going, didn't know what the future held, but I knew, deep down, that this was the first step toward healing, toward finding a way to live again, to honor her memory not with sorrow, but with the life she had inspired me to reclaim. Because I knew, as I walked away from the life I had once known, that this was not the end. It was a beginning, a chance to find my own path, to rebuild, to carry her memory with me, not as a weight, but as a light that would guide me forward. And in that quiet, in that newfound hope, I found the strength to take another step, and then another, each one leading me toward a future that was mine to create. This story shows the depth of grief, the weight of unresolved pain, and the strength it takes to find oneself again after an unimaginable loss. It speaks to the power of resilience, highlighting that healing doesn't mean forgetting those we've loved, but rather learning to live in a way that honors their memory. Ultimately, it's about finding the courage to let go of what holds us back, embracing the unknown and rediscovering purpose amidst the shadows of heartbreak. If this story moved you or reminded you of the strength within us all, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories of resilience, healing, and self-discovery. Let us know in the comments, how do you think one can start rebuilding after a loss? Thank you for watching, and remember, even in the darkest moments, there's a way forward.